A rat hole. That's what American politicians called South Korea in the 1950s, and there were reasons for that. Since it was a poor and war-weary country, but being in the sphere of U.S. interests, they were the largest recipients of financial aid from the U.S. But this aid did not help economic development in any way. The poverty of South Korea looked especially contrasting against the background of North Korea, which had successfully recovered 10 years after the war and was demonstrating higher economic growth rates compared to the South. And all this did not please the Americans, who believed that money was being spent in a rat hole, and the problem was the following. Despite the financial aid, and in some periods the Korean budget was financed by as much as 80% of American money, corruption and inefficient management hindered the growth of the state. Starting from 1948 and until 1960, the power in the country was under the control of the authoritarian president Lee Syngman. And although nominally there were democratic elections in the country, each time the president and the Liberal Party, controlled by him, falsified the election results, ensuring the victory of the incumbent president. And instead of engaging in economic policy, the president and his party mostly relied on American financial assistance. It cannot be said at all that the government did not carry out economic reforms, but all these reforms enriched only him and the businessmen close to him. Of course, such behavior provoked discontent from both Allies and Korean society. And in 1960, when the president once again won the elections, gaining 100% of the vote, the April Revolution took place in the country and the government was overthrown. And a year later, taking advantage of political instability, the military seized power, and in 1962, General Park Chung-hee became president. Park inherited a very poor country, with a GDP per capita lower than that of poor African countries, and completely dependent on American aid. The country's economic specialization was so primitive that the main industries were rice cultivation and fishing, and the most complex export-oriented industry was the production of textile products. The total amount of exports was a meager $100 million. And here we can say that the Koreans were lucky, because they got a president who not only wanted to change the country, but also understood how to do it. Relatively speaking, he understood perfectly well that it was the primitive specialization of the economy on rice cultivation and fish catches that was a serious barrier to growth. And in order to escape the poverty trap, they need a structural transformation of the economy. That is, it is necessary to create completely new industries in the country that did not exist before, but which have high export potential. To some extent, he had the logic of an entrepreneur who strives for the growth of the company, looking for new promising products and markets for them. The only difference was that he thought on a state scale. He also understood perfectly well that only private business could create these new industries. The only problem was that each famous businessman had a certain field of activity that completely suited him, and it would be very difficult to convince these businessmen, especially since each of them was satisfied with the status quo. For example, the owner of such a now famous company as Samsung started his business with trading fish and noodles. Then he built the largest textile factory in the country. The owner of Hyundai was engaged in the production of building materials and built roads. And the owner of LG, a now famous electronics manufacturer, started his business with the production of plastics. How did General Park solve this problem? He gathered all the businessmen and put them before the fact. If you want to continue to use government support, then the activities of your company must correspond to the goals of the state and must be concentrated in the industries that will be selected by the government. Of course, not everyone liked this idea, so Park gave them the opportunity to think, sending them behind bars. And having received such an eye-opening lesson, the business was forced to agree. And the owners of the same Samsung, Hyundai, LG, Daewoo, and other companies were forced to start businesses in industries in which they had neither knowledge, nor experience, nor even technology. In fact, all these famous Korean companies are only those who were able to survive, adapt, and not just survive, but achieve stunning success. Of course, now the success of all these companies is associated exclusively with private initiative. Hyundai itself wanted to produce cars, Samsung itself wanted to make electronics, and LG televisions. However, for some reason, the fact remains overlooked that the entire transformation of these companies began precisely under Park Chung-hee and precisely thanks to his coercion.